What if a soldier returned home not to find glory, but a broken house, standing alone in the middle of quiet fields? Would he walk away or rebuild it into a place where lost hearts could find peace again? This is the story of Daniel, a humble veteran and his loyal dog Buddy, who turned an old wooden cabin into a home for those who had nowhere else to go. A story of kindness, faith, and second chances waiting beneath the summer sky. Sit back and let your heart rest in the warmth of hope. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The summer air over Montana was warm and calm. The wind was gentle, moving slowly through the tall grass that surrounded the narrow dirt road. The sky was clear and wide, with soft white clouds drifting lazily. It was a quiet day, a day that smelled of dust, hay, and the faint sweetness of dry earth. The season had ripened into its peaceful rhythm. Daniel Harris guided his old truck down the path until the small wooden house appeared in view. He was 35 years old, a man of sturdy build, but lean from years of physical work. His face carried the marks of sun and time, his jaw lined with a faint roughness of a short beard. His hair was brown, cut neat, but showing hints of gray near the temples. There was a calm sadness in his hazel eyes, the look of someone who had seen more than he could ever say. He wore a light brown jacket, the kind used in cool evenings, and faded blue jeans with the edges worn thin. He stopped the truck near the porch and turned off the engine. Silence rushed in. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of space and distance. The house stood quiet among the waving fields, its wooden boards pale and cracked. The front steps leaned slightly to one side, and a single window reflected the soft light of the sky. This was the house his grandfather had built, the same one Daniel had visited as a boy before life had pulled him away. He stepped out of the truck, the ground crunching beneath his boots. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the scent of dry grass and distant pine. It was the smell of his childhood, of days before war, before loss. He could almost hear his grandfather's slow voice again, telling him to listen to the wind because it carried stories older than men. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound of the open plain wash over him. Then a bark broke the stillness. From the truck, a large German shepherd leaped out with ease. His coat shimmered in the sun, black and golden with streaks of silver near the muzzle. His name was Buddy, 6 years old, strong and alert, but gentle in movement. Buddy had been with Daniel through his last years of service. They had survived the kind of nights no man could forget, the kind filled with dust, fire, and broken echoes. When Daniel was injured, it was Buddy who had found him and stayed by his side until help came. Since that day, they had never been apart. Buddy began to trot around the yard, nose to the ground, tail wagging lightly as he explored. He sniffed every corner, every fence post, as if tracing old ghosts. Daniel watched him and smiled faintly. The sight brought warmth to a part of him that had long been cold. The dog moved with purpose, stopping every few steps to raise his head and test the air. It was as though he were searching for something familiar, perhaps the scent of the man who had once owned this land. Daniel climbed the porch stairs slowly. Each step creaked under his weight. He placed his hand on the wooden railing, feeling the roughness of age beneath his fingers. The door handle was cool and slightly loose. When he turned it, the door opened with a low groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and quiet. The sunlight slipped through a half-opened window, falling across the floor in golden stripes. The small room smelled of old timber, dry paper, and time. A chair leaned against the wall beside a table that held a rusted lamp. On a shelf, a few forgotten books rested, their pages curled and yellowed. The place looked untouched, as though his grandfather had stepped out one day and never returned. Daniel's chest tightened. He could see the faint marks on the floor where a rocking chair once stood, could almost hear the sound of it moving back and forth in the long evenings of summer. He took a slow walk through the house. Every sound he made felt too loud. His hand brushed over the worn frame of a family photograph. His grandfather's face smiled from behind the glass, eyes bright and steady, standing in front of this very porch with the same open field stretching behind him. Daniel's throat ached. It was strange how memories could feel alive when everything else had gone still. He turned and looked outside through the window. Buddy was still in the yard, moving through the tall grass. The dog's tail flicked as he paused near a tree stump, sniffing and circling as if remembering an old friend. The sight filled Daniel with a soft sadness. He understood that dogs carried memory in their senses, not in thought. Yet it comforted him to believe that Buddy could feel the presence of what once was. The sun rose higher. Heat shimmered faintly over the distant hills, but the breeze kept the day kind. Daniel stepped outside again and sat on the porch steps. The wood was warm under his hands. Buddy came over and lay beside him, resting his head on Daniel's boot. The dog's breathing was slow and even, his eyes half closed. Daniel reached down and ran his fingers through the thick fur behind Buddy's neck. The rhythm of that touch calmed him more than words ever could. For a long time, neither man nor dog moved. The only sound was the soft rush of wind moving through the fields. Daniel looked toward the horizon where the land met the sky. He thought about the years that had taken him far from this place, the long nights overseas, the faces of friends who had not made it home. He thought of how quiet the world had become since then, how hard it was to find meaning in simple days. But here, on this porch, with Buddy beside him, and the scent of dry summer grass all around, something shifted inside him. The heaviness in his chest did not vanish, but it eased, as if the land itself was willing to carry part of it for him. He took a deep breath, and the air tasted of pine and dust and the faint sweetness of hay. He looked down at Buddy. The dog opened his eyes, alert but relaxed, and gave a slow wag of his tail. Daniel smiled again, small and tired, but real. He whispered, softly, though there was no one else to hear, "We are home now." Buddy blinked, his ears twitching, then turned his gaze toward the field as if standing guard over this quiet place. The light had turned golden, soft on the edges of the hills. Daniel sat there a little longer, watching the wind bend the grass and move across the land like a slow wave. He felt the house behind him, solid and waiting. It was worn, but it was his. And for the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man passing through. He felt like a man who had finally arrived. The summer afternoon was calm and mild. The air was warm but soft, the sky pale blue, and the light fell gently through the branches behind the old wooden house. The wind brushed against the tall grass, carrying the smell of earth and hay. It was a quiet day that felt like the land itself was breathing slowly. Behind the house, Daniel Harris walked through the narrow path, lined with weeds that reached up to his knees. His boots made a faint crunching sound as he pushed through the overgrowth. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust, He stopped when he saw a small wooden shed standing at the far end of the yard. The structure leaned slightly to one side. Its roof was darkened by years of rain, and the walls were streaked with age. The door hung crookedly, its surface cracked and eaten by time. Spider webs stretched between the handle and the door frame. Daniel stood still for a moment, looking at it with a quiet frown. He remembered his grandfather once kept tools and supplies here when it had still been part of the stable. The horses were long gone, the fences broken, and the yard empty except for the wind. He felt a mix of sadness and curiosity. He had spent his first night in the main house the day before, but the thought of this small, forgotten building at the edge of the yard had stayed in his mind. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the rough wood of the door. It was dry and soft under his fingers, the kind of wood that had been through too many summers. He pushed lightly, and the door gave way with a low creak. The sound echoed through the shed like an old sigh. Inside it was dark, the air thick and musty. Dust hung in the sunlight that streamed through a gap in the roof. The floor was covered with dry leaves and the remains of broken boards. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. His movements were careful, as though he might disturb something sacred. His life, since leaving the army, had been full of noise and restlessness, and this silence felt almost unfamiliar. The only sound now was the distant call of birds and the faint panting of Buddy behind him. Buddy, the 6-year-old German shepherd, stood at the doorway. His fur was black and tan, with a light shimmer under the soft light. His eyes were bright amber, sharp and intelligent, his body steady and alert. He had the posture of a soldier on watch. Daniel had always admired how the dog could move from calm to focused in a single breath. Buddy's loyalty had been tested in the worst of places. When Daniel was injured overseas, Buddy had dragged him through the sand by his jacket strap to safety. The scar on Daniel's shoulder was a reminder of that night. Now the same dog watched him with quiet patience, his tail moving slightly as if waiting for permission to follow. Daniel spoke softly without words, a small gesture with his hand, and Buddy stepped inside. The sound of his paws against the wood was light but steady. Daniel looked around the space. A few rusted tools leaned against the wall, their handles eaten by time. An old saddle lay in the corner, the leather cracked and dry. The smell of dust filled his lungs, but there was something else beneath it too, a faint trace of oil and earth that reminded him of the days when this place had been alive. He took off his jacket and hung it on a nail by the door. The work felt natural, almost comforting. He had lived years of strict routines, so the act of cleaning, of restoring order to something forgotten, gave him a sense of control. He picked up a broom that had been left behind, its bristles stiff but usable, and began to sweep slowly across the floor. Each stroke of the broom stirred up clouds of dust that sparkled briefly in the light. His breathing became steady, his mind quiet. There was no rush, no noise, no one giving commands. The rhythm of sweeping was simple and pure, the kind of labor that let his thoughts drift without pain. He thought of his grandfather again, and how the old man used to say that keeping things clean kept the mind clear. Maybe that was true. Buddy watched him at first, his head tilted slightly, then began to move around the shed, sniffing at the corners. He moved with quiet curiosity, tail wagging in small movements. Daniel smiled at the sight. He had always found comfort in the way Buddy explored new spaces as if he were mapping the world with his senses. But as the minutes passed, he noticed something different. Buddy had stopped near one corner of the shed where the floor met the back wall. His ears were forward and his tail stiffened. He sniffed again, longer this time, and then let out a low, short bark. It was not loud, not alarmed, but questioning. Daniel paused his work and turned toward him. The dog was staring at the floor, one paw lifted slightly. He moved closer, placed the paw down, and began to scratch lightly at the old boards. The sound was soft but deliberate. Daniel set the broom aside and walked toward him. His boots creaked on the wood. He knelt down beside Buddy and looked at the spot. There was nothing unusual to see, just old floorboards dark with dirt and age. Buddy whined quietly and looked up at Daniel, his eyes bright and insistent. Daniel felt a small stir of tension. He trusted this dog more than most people he had ever met. Buddy had never been wrong when he sensed something. He placed his palm against the floor where the dog had scratched. The wood was cool and dry. He pressed harder. It felt solid, but under his hand there was a faint hollow tone, the kind that told him there was space beneath. For a moment, he stayed still, listening. His heartbeat felt louder in the quiet shed. The light through the gap in the roof shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead and dust swirled around them. He looked at Buddy again. The dog's ears twitched, and his eyes remained fixed on the same spot. Daniel exhaled slowly. He told himself it was probably nothing more than old boards coming loose after years of neglect. But the dog's steady focus made that explanation feel thin. He decided not to open anything yet. The day was long, and the light was beginning to fade. He would return tomorrow with better tools. For now, he would finish cleaning. He gave Buddy a small pat on the neck and said softly, "Good job." The dog's tail wagged once, a single quiet thump against the floor. Daniel stood and returned to sweeping, though his eyes drifted toward that corner more than once. When the last of the dust was cleared and the floorboards showed their grain again, he leaned the broom against the wall. The air felt lighter inside the shed, as if the place had woken from a long sleep. He looked around and imagined how it could be. Shelves for tools, a space to work, a place to build something new. The thought gave him a faint sense of pride. Outside, the wind had cooled slightly. The sun was dipping toward the trees. He closed the shed door gently and turned the rusty latch. The wood groaned but held firm. Buddy walked at his side, tail brushing Daniel's leg. The two of them crossed the yard together. Daniel looked back once at the small wooden structure, its edges glowing in the golden light. He did not know yet what Buddy had found, but he felt that this old corner of the property was not finished telling its story. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the fields fade into dusk, the image of the dog scratching at the floor stayed in his mind. It was nothing, he told himself, but a quiet part of him was not convinced. The morning light was soft and even. A faint mist still clung to the grass, and the air carried the cool scent of dew and pine. The sky above Montana was pale blue without harsh sunlight, the kind of summer morning that felt calm and patient. Daniel Harris stood outside the small shed behind his grandfather's old house, the same place where Buddy had scratched at the floor the day before. He had not slept much. Thoughts of that hollow sound beneath the floorboards had kept him awake. Now, with the first warmth of morning touching the yard, he returned with a hammer and a small pry bar. His body felt heavy from the memories that often followed him at night, but his mind was steady. Years in the army had taught him discipline, and even now, every movement carried quiet precision. Buddy was beside him, tail moving slowly, amber eyes bright with awareness. The German shepherd, strong and alert, had already inspected the perimeter of the shed. His coat glowed faintly in the filtered light. He was calm now, but ready as if he too understood that today was important. Daniel stepped inside the shed. The air still smelled of dry wood and old dust, but now it felt less forgotten, as though the place had begun to breathe again. He knelt near the corner where Buddy had stopped the day before. The floorboard looked no different from the others, yet Daniel's memory of that faint, hollow sound stayed sharp. He placed the tip of the pry bar between the seams of the wood. The first push gave no result. The second time, the plank shifted slightly, with a dry cracking sound. He worked carefully, sweat forming along his hairline. The wood resisted, but finally lifted, revealing a small, dark space beneath. The smell that rose was faintly oily, the scent of something preserved long ago. Buddy stepped closer, nose twitching. He lowered his head and sniffed the air. His ears turned forward, and his body stilled. Daniel reached into the gap, his fingers brushing against something solid and smooth. He pulled out a small wooden box, wrapped in an old cloth, darkened by oil and time. The box was heavier than it looked. Its surface was rough but intact, the wood dark with age. He sat back on his heels and rested the box on his lap. His breath slowed. He ran his hand across the lid, tracing the faint carvings that had nearly vanished. For a long moment, he hesitated. The quiet inside the shed pressed around him. The world outside seemed far away. When he finally opened the lid, the hinges gave a soft groan. Inside lay a notebook, a folded map, and a few black and white photographs. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. The photos showed a group of young men in old military uniforms. They stood together on a grassy hill, smiling arms over each other's shoulders. Their faces carried the light of youth and the weariness of soldiers who had seen too much. Daniel studied the photos carefully. He did not recognize any of the men, but something in their expressions felt familiar. A mixture of pride and pain he had seen many times in the mirror. He picked up the notebook next. The leather cover was cracked but still strong. On its front was written in simple letters, "For those who still believe." The handwriting was firm, patient, and deeply human. He opened the first page. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. His grandfather had written in a steady, measured hand. Each line carried the voice of a man who had lived through silence and storm alike. Daniel began to read. The first entries were plain observations about the ranch notes, about repairs and supplies. But then the tone shifted. His grandfather wrote about men who came from faraway veterans who had nowhere left to go. Some arrived quietly at night, some sent by friends who knew this was a safe place. The words painted a picture of kindness hidden behind simplicity. Daniel turned another page and read about a man named Frank, a soldier who could not sleep because of the memories that followed him. His grandfather had written that Frank stayed for 2 months, helping repair fences and paint walls until he was ready to face the world again. Another entry mentioned a woman named Claire, who had been a nurse during the war, bringing food and medicine to those who stopped by. The more Daniel read, the heavier the pages felt in his hands. His grandfather had built something far greater than a home. He had built a refuge, a quiet shelter for those who had been broken by the same things Daniel once faced. The shed, the house the entire ranch had once been alive with the footsteps of people searching for peace. He paused and looked up. Buddy was lying near the open door, his head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The sight of the dog made Daniel's chest tighten with emotion. He felt the weight of years pressing down, but also a rising warmth. He thought of his grandfather, quiet strength, the kind that asked for no recognition. He reached for the folded map inside the box. When he spread it open on the floor, he saw the hand-drawn marks, circles, and lines that connected small towns across Montana and neighboring states. Next to some of the markings were small initials and dates. Daniel understood then that this was not just a record. It was a network, a path that his grandfather had built, guiding lost soldiers toward places of safety. A soft breeze moved through the cracks in the walls. The pages of the notebook fluttered gently. Daniel sat still, staring at the map, the photos, the notebook, feeling as if time had folded back on itself. For the first time since returning home, he felt close to something larger than his own grief. He picked up one of the photographs again. The men in it were young and strong, but their smiles carried pain. He could almost hear their laughter carried away by the wind that now whispered through the shed. He wondered how many of them had walked through this very door. Buddy stirred and came to sit beside him. Daniel reached out and rested a hand on the dog back. The fur felt warm beneath, his palm steady and alive. He whispered softly without words, as if the dog could understand the feeling that swelled in his chest. In that moment, Daniel realized this place was more than an inheritance. It was a promise. His grandfather had not built walls of wood and stone, but of compassion and trust. Daniel had thought he was returning to ruins. Instead, he had found a legacy that reached beyond generations. He closed the notebook and set it gently back into the box. The air inside the shed seemed to hold a quiet peace now. The weight that had followed him for years felt lighter. He ran a hand through his hair and leaned back against the wall, letting the sunlight touch his face through the cracks in the boards. The sound of Buddy's steady breathing filled the silence. Daniel smiled faintly. For the first time since coming home, he felt something close to calm. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. He looked down at the box one last time before closing the lid. He would keep it safe. He would honor what his grandfather had begun. As he stood and looked around the small shed, he saw it differently now. It was no longer a place of decay, but the first step toward rebuilding what had been lost. He reached for Buddy's collar and gave it a gentle pat. The dog rose to his feet, tail swaying slightly, and followed Daniel out into the light. The morning sun was soft, the air warm but kind. Behind them, the shed stood silent once more, holding within it the quiet history of belief and kindness that had survived the passing of time. The afternoon sun of Montana was soft and golden. The light spread gently over the valley, touching the dry grass and old wooden fences with a calm warmth. The sky was clear, and the air carried a faint scent of pine and dust. It was one of those summer days that moved slowly, the kind that made silence feel alive. Daniel Harris sat on the porch steps of his grandfather's old house, his elbows resting on his knees, a mug of coffee cooling beside him. Buddy lay nearby, his body stretched across the wooden planks, eyes half closed, ears twitching now and then at the sound of the wind. For a moment, everything seemed still. Daniel had spent the past week cleaning, repairing, and thinking. The discovery of the wooden box and his grandfather's words had stirred something deep inside him, a feeling both heavy and grounding. Yet the peace of the valley did not erase the weight of his real life. Money was running out. The last of his savings had gone into fuel and supplies. The small jobs he picked up in town barely covered food. He could not deny that survival pressed close, even as the land around him seemed to whisper of purpose. He looked down at his hands, calloused and dry fingers, marked with faint scars that had never fully healed. His thoughts drifted to the soldiers his grandfather had written about, men who had come here broken and left with a fragment of hope. What would his grandfather do now with bills piling up and no one to turn to? That question lingered without answer. Buddy lifted his head, ears pricked. A faint hum grew in the distance, the sound of a car engine climbing the gravel road that wound through the valley. Daniel turned his gaze toward the horizon. A dark vehicle appeared through the shimmer of heat, moving steadily closer. Few people ever came this way. He stood brushing dust from his jeans and waited. Buddy rose as well, posture alert, but calm, his tail moving slowly, golden fur catching the sunlight. The car stopped near the front gate, its tires crunching on gravel. A man stepped out, closing the door behind him with a deliberate motion. He looked to be in his late 40s, lean and neatly dressed in light slacks and a crisp blue shirt that spoke of city comfort. His dark hair was combed back, and his smile was practiced the kind that had been used in 100 polite negotiations. He carried a black folder under his arm. He approached with measured confidence, the kind of stride belonging to someone used to being welcomed. His voice was smooth when he spoke. "Good afternoon, sir. I hope I am not intruding. My name is Patrick Hayes. I work with Summit Realty out of Bozeman." He stopped at the base of the porch steps, his shoes already dusted with the pale soil of the yard. Daniel studied him quietly. The man's expression was pleasant, but his eyes moved too quickly, scanning the house, the land, the shed behind it. He had the alertness of someone calculating value. Daniel nodded, once his voice low and steady. "What brings you out this way?" Patrick smiled, opening his folder and pulling out a few printed sheets. "I will get straight to the point. Our company represents a development group that has recently acquired the surrounding acreage. They are planning a resort project, high-end cabins, a lodge, the works. Your property sits right in the middle of it. The investors would like to make you an offer before construction begins." Buddy moved closer to Daniel, his head lifting slightly. Daniel placed a calm hand on the dog, back feeling the slow, steady rise of his breathing. He said nothing, yet letting the man continue. Patrick took out another paper and handed it forward. "The offer is fair, well above market value. 200,000 in cash, all closing fees covered. We can finalize in less than a month." He looked around, his smile widening. "You could start fresh. This old place must be hard to keep up, especially on your own." Daniel did not take the paper. His gaze moved past the man toward the fields beyond, golden and quiet under the sun. The house behind him creaked softly in the breeze. He thought of his grandfather, sitting here decades ago, perhaps watching the same stretch of land. He turned his attention back to Patrick, his expression unreadable. "You said they are building cabins." "Yes, luxury accommodations, a spa, even a golf course eventually. It will bring jobs to the area. Property values will triple. You could use that money to move into town. Start over." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He looked down at Buddy, who had settled again beside him, head on his paws. amber eyes watching quietly. The dog-calm presence felt like a steady weight against the pull of temptation. Patrick mistook the silence for consideration and pressed further. I understand it can be difficult to let go, but progress is inevitable. Places like this, he gestured around, they fade away sooner or later. You can hold on to the past, or you can take what it offers you now. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. How did you find this place? Public record mostly. The survey shows the title under your name. When land changes hands, opportunity follows. Daniel nodded, once emotion, small but certain. He looked toward the porch, where Buddy eyes met his. There was something in that steady gaze, a wordless reminder of the notebook of his grandfather, promised to help those who had nowhere else to go. Patrick stepped closer, lowering his tone as if speaking to reason. Look, I know a good deal when I see one. You are sitting on a piece of land that could change your life. You fought for this country, didn't you? You deserve comfort. Let this place go, and let it serve someone else for a change. The words hung in the air like dust. Daniel's hands clenched slightly at his sides. For years, he had struggled with the feeling that his service had left him without a home. Now the idea of selling the only ground that had ever meant something felt like losing that home again. He took a deep breath. The warmth of the afternoon pressed against him heavy, but grounding. Buddy shifted his weight, his body brushing Daniel's leg as if offering silent strength. Daniel looked Patrick in the eye. His voice when he spoke was calm, steady, final. I am not selling. Patrick blinked, caught off guard by the firmness of the answer. He recovered quickly, forcing a polite smile. Of course, I understand these decisions take time. No. Daniel said again, his tone softer, but firm. This house was built by a man who helped others when no one else would. It gave shelter to people who had lost everything. It will not be turned into a playground for tourists. Patrick's smile faltered. He straightened his folder and adjusted his cuff. Well, the offer will remain open for a few weeks. I will leave my card. Daniel did not respond. He watched as the man walked back to his car. The sound of the engine broke the stillness again, fading slowly as the vehicle disappeared down the road. When silence returned, Daniel exhaled slowly. The world seemed larger around him, the sky endless and still. He sat back on the porch steps, running a hand through his hair. The wind moved softly through the trees. Buddy climbed up beside him, resting his head against Daniel's knee. Daniel looked down and managed a faint smile. The dog eyes were calm and knowing. In them, he saw his grandfather, quiet strength, the belief that kindness and memory mattered more than comfort. The sun lowered behind the hills, throwing long shadows across the yard. Daniel stayed there until the air cooled his hand resting on Buddy's fur. He felt both weary and alive, anchored to this place by something deeper than ownership. He spoke softly to the fading light. This home stays. Buddy's tail moved once against the wooden porch. Together they sat in silence, the golden light fading to dusk, the valley breathing with them as if the land itself approved. The evening air in Montana was warm and gentle. The sky held a soft golden hue, fading into a tender blue as the sun lowered behind the fields. The scent of pine and dry earth filled the breeze, carrying the quiet hum of crickets. It was the kind of summer dusk that seemed to breathe with the land itself. Daniel Harris stood by the porch, railing a thin film of sweat on his forehead, his shirt rolled at the sleeves. The day had been long spent clearing weeds from the edge of the fence line. Buddy lay a few feet away, the German shepherd coat glowing under the soft light, his ears twitching every now and then at the sound of distant birds. Daniel had begun to understand the rhythm of solitude. The days passed slowly, and each chore brought a quiet sense of purpose. Yet under that calm, a dull ache lingered born from years of uncertainty, and the ghost of war that still followed him like a faint shadow. He had turned down the offer from the land agent, and though he felt peace in his choice, the weight of survival still pressed close. A faint rumble came from the road beyond the hill. Daniel lifted his head. The sound was familiar, the slow, uneven roll of an old truck engine. Moments later, a small, dusty pickup appeared, its body faded green with age headlights flickering slightly. The truck stopped near the front gate, and a figure stepped out. The man was tall, but slightly bent, with age his movements deliberate and measured. His face was tanned and weathered with deep lines etched by time and sunlight. A gray beard covered his jaw, trimmed neatly, though uneven in color. His eyes, a pale blue, were sharp but kind. He wore a canvas jacket and old jeans tucked into worn boots. His hands, strong despite their age, held a paper bag in one and a metal lantern in the other. Daniel walked toward him. The man smiled before speaking, his voice deep and slow-shaped by years of work and wind. Heard someone moved back into the Harris place, thought I should see who is breathing life into it again. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. You must be Ben. My grandfather talked about you in his journals. The man chuckled, the sound dry and soft. Ben Keller, at your service. Your grandfather and I built that fence back in '73. He was the kind of man who could fix anything with 2 nails and a story. They shook hands firmly. Daniel felt the strength still present in Ben's grip. The older man studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. You look like him around the eyes, only more tired. War will do that to a man, I suppose. Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. Ben lifted the paper bag and smiled again. Brought some coffee, figured you might not have much left out here. And this old lamp still works if you got oil. Thought you could use some light. Daniel thanked him, gesturing for him to come closer to the porch. Ben climbed the steps slowly, but steady, setting the lantern down on the wooden floorboards. He looked around, taking in the house with quiet affection. Time has been rough on her, but she is still standing. A good sign. They sat down on the porch. Daniel poured water into a small pot over a portable stove. The rich smell of coffee soon mingled with the air. For a while they talked of small things, weather fences, and the stubborn nature of Montana summers. The kind of conversation that did not need to say much to mean everything. As the sky deepened into orange and blue, Ben leaned forward, glancing at the lines of wire running along the edge of the yard. You got power yet? Daniel shook his head. The wiring is old. I have not had time to check if it still runs. Ben pushed himself to his feet. Well then, let us give it a shot. I have still got a bit of spark left in me. He grinned, eyes glinting with humor. They walked to the side of the house, where the old electrical box clung to the wall like a relic from another era. Ben examined it with practiced eyes, muttering softly. He had worked as a mechanic after the war, fixing machinery for farmers across the valley. His hands moved with memory, unscrewing panels and cleaning the dusty fuses. Daniel fetched tools from the shed, while Buddy followed close tail, swaying lightly. When Daniel handed over the screwdriver, Buddy sat by his side watching every movement, as if guarding the work. You have got a good dog there, Ben said, tightening a wire. Best partner I ever had, Daniel replied. Ben nodded thoughtfully. A man heart heals faster when he has got something loyal beside him. The work stretched into twilight. Ben showed Daniel how to test the lines, how to clean the sockets, and check for current without shocking himself. He spoke with the patience of someone who had taught many men before. Daniel listened carefully, the focus steadying his mind. Sweat rolled down his back, but there was a strange peace in the rhythm of work, the click of metal, and the hum of memory. When they finished, Ben stepped back and wiped his hands. "Try the switch, son." Daniel hesitated for a second, then reached toward the small lever by the porch door. His fingers pressed down. A faint hum ran through the wires, and suddenly the porch light flickered, glowing softly. The faint yellow light spilled across the boards, warming the air with a gentle radiance. Daniel exhaled, surprised by the quiet surge of emotion that rose in his chest. For years, light had been a thing of necessity, never of comfort. But here in this house, it felt like the return of something sacred. Buddy barked once, tail thumping against the floor. Ben laughed a deep sound full of satisfaction. "There you go. Thought she still had some life left in her." Daniel smiled, his voice quiet. "It has been dark here for a long time." Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. "Every home can find its light again, no matter how long it has been out." They sat back down, the glow from the porch lamp surrounding them like a small campfire. The coffee was gone, but the warmth lingered. The stars began to bloom in the clear night sky, and the distant hum of crickets rose again. Buddy lay near the steps, his head resting on Daniel's boot. When Daniel looked down, the dog lifted his muzzle, a glove clutched gently in his mouth. He dropped it at Daniel's feet tail, wagging slowly as if to say, "Keep going, you are doing fine." Daniel laughed softly, the sound genuine and free. Ben chuckled beside him, eyes gleaming with a quiet knowing. "You have got a helper with heart," he said. The night deepened, the light steady. The house, that had once stood cold and silent, now glowed faintly under the summer sky. Daniel leaned back his shoulders, loosening his breathing calm. For the first time in years, he felt not just alive, but at home. Inside, the old wiring hummed softly, the sound like a heartbeat returning to life. Buddy tail brushed against his leg, and the glow of the lamp painted gentle light across their faces. Daniel looked toward the field beyond, where the darkness met the horizon, and whispered to himself, "I think he would be proud." The breeze carried the scent of grass and coffee. The night was still full of quiet life, and the light of the house shone steady against the endless summer dusk. The sun rose gently over the valley, casting long golden lines across the grass. The air was mild, and the sky clear, touched with the soft blue of early morning. Birds moved through the air in slow arcs, their wings cutting against the calm of the new day. The warmth of summer had settled over Montana in full, and the land seemed to hum with quiet life. Daniel Harris stood beside the wooden fence, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a tin of white paint in the other. His shirt was worn, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Sweat darkened the fabric near his shoulders, but his movements were calm, steady, and sure. The rhythm of work was slow but peaceful. The porch light from the night before had gone out with the dawn, but the memory of its glow still lingered in him like a soft echo. Buddy rested nearby, stretched out beneath the shade of a tree. His fur gleamed in the sunlight, black and tan, with silver threads near the neck. Every so often, he would lift his head and glance toward the road, his tail brushing lightly against the grass. For the first time since coming home, Daniel felt that the place was beginning to live again. The walls no longer looked abandoned. The smell of paint and soil replaced the dust and rot that once filled the air. The silence of the land no longer felt empty, but waiting. Then came the sound of tires on gravel. Daniel turned toward the road, wiping his hands on a rag. A truck was approaching, smaller and newer than Ben old pickup. It came to a stop near the gate. The door opened, and a young man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 20s, lean and slightly tall, with short brown hair and a trimmed beard. His skin was sunburned along the neck, and his posture carried the stiffness of someone used to carrying weight both on his back and in his mind. He wore a simple gray shirt and jeans torn at the knee. His boots were military issue, scuffed but polished. His eyes were green, sharp, yet uncertain, as they took in the sight of the house. Daniel set the paintbrush down and waited. The young man hesitated for a moment before walking closer. His voice was low and careful. "Name is Luke Turner. Someone in town said a veteran was living out here. I thought maybe you could use some help." Daniel studied him quietly. Luke was nervous, though he tried to hide it. His hands moved restlessly by his sides, the way a soldier might when unused to calm. Daniel saw a reflection of himself from years ago in that awkward posture. He nodded slowly. "Help I could use? You know how to handle a hammer." A faint smile crossed Luke's face. "I can manage that, sir." Daniel motioned toward the fence. "Then start with this side. Paint's in the tin." Luke set to work without another word. The air filled with the sound of brushes against wood and the quiet rhythm of labor. Buddy trotted over, sniffing Luke's boots before sitting beside him, tail wagging once. Luke chuckled softly. "Good boy." Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent. When they stopped for water, Luke leaned on the fence, staring out at the field. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost to himself. "I served with the 91st Infantry. Got out 2 years ago. Been drifting since." Daniel nodded, but said nothing. He knew the kind of silence that followed such words. The kind that did not ask for pity, only understanding. He handed Luke a tin cup of water. "You are not drifting now. Paint's still wet." Luke looked up, meeting his gaze, and smiled for the first time that day. The small, honest smile of someone beginning to breathe again. That evening, as the sun sank low, another sound broke the stillness. A second vehicle came down the road, slower this time. An old station wagon, pale blue with rust along the doors. From it stepped a woman carrying a burlap sack. She was in her 40s, her frame slender but strong, her movements deliberate. Her hair was light brown, streaked with gray, pulled back neatly under a scarf. Her skin was pale, but sun touched her hands, lined from work. She wore a faded dress and sturdy shoes. Her eyes were warm and alert, the eyes of someone who had seen suffering yet carried gentleness in its place. Daniel met her halfway across the yard. "Evening, Mom. Can I help you?" The woman smiled softly. "I hope so. My name is Claire Sutton. I was a nurse during the war. I heard this place might be open to helping folks find steady ground. I brought seeds, vegetables mostly. Thought the soil could use new life." Daniel nodded slowly. The name Claire struck him with a faint memory from his grandfather's notebook, though he could not be sure. He glanced at Buddy, who was already trotting over, tail wagging as if to welcome her. She knelt down, patting Buddy's head with a fondness that seemed natural. "You are a handsome one, aren't you?" Daniel helped her carry the bag toward the small garden patch behind the shed. The earth there was dry, but soft. Together, they knelt and began planting. Luke joined them quietly, his hands steady as he pressed soil around each sprout. As they worked, Claire spoke in a low tone about the years after the war, about the men she had treated who never came home in spirit, even if their bodies had. Her words carried no bitterness, only compassion. She had lost her husband young and never remarried, choosing instead to travel from town to town, helping where she could. Daniel listened without interrupting. Every word felt like it belonged here, in the quiet rhythm of planting. When she finished, he said simply, "This house is open to those who need a place to rest." Claire smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes softening. "Then I think you have already built something important here. The last of the seeds went into the ground." Luke fetched water from the pump and poured it carefully over the rows. The scent of wet earth rose sweet and strong. By the time the light faded, the three of them stood together near the porch, watching the first stars appear. Buddy lay between them, his tail moving slowly across the boards. The glow from the lamp behind the window spilled softly over them, painting their faces gold. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence held not loneliness, but peace. Daniel felt the weight in his chest loosen the years of isolation, thinning into something gentler. He looked at Luke, then at Claire, and finally at Buddy, whose eyes gleamed under the dim light. He realized then that his grandfather dream had not ended with the last page of the notebook. It had only been waiting for someone to begin it again. Buddy yawned and stretched his body against the porch step, then turned his gaze toward Daniel. His eyes held a calm intelligence, as if he too understood that the house was no longer a lonely one. The night deepened the wind, soft against the fields. Inside the house, a faint warmth glowed through the window, and Daniel felt for the first time that the promise written long ago in his grandfather's words was alive once more. The morning sky hung pale and still over the valley, a calm light resting across the fields of wet grass. The warmth of the season had softened into the quiet heaviness that came before rain. Clouds gathered above the distant ridges, slowly folding into each other, until the blue was swallowed by gray. The air carried the scent of water and earth, and the promise of change. Daniel Harris stood near the porch, tying down the loose ends of a canvas sheet that covered the woodpile. His hands were strong and calloused the skin along his knuckles, marked by small cuts from days of work. His shirt was damp with sweat, but his mind was sharp-focused. Buddy stood a few feet away, tail flicking back and forth, his golden-black fur bristling with alertness as if he too could feel the storm drawing near. Inside the house, the faint sound of voices came through the open window. Ben Keller sat at the table, the edges of a folded document spread before him, his glasses balanced low on his nose. The old man hair was silver white, and his posture straightened with purpose, though the stiffness of age lingered in his shoulders. Across from him, Luke Turner was reading a letter out loud, his voice careful, steady. Claire Sutton sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes moving softly between the two men. The papers bore the seal of the local county office and the faint, typewritten words that would make their work official. Daniel stepped inside, brushing his boots against the mat. The smell of coffee lingered, mixed with the faint scent of wet soil from the open door. Ben looked up, his voice deep but kind. "Morning sun, looks like rain coming sooner than we thought." Daniel nodded. "The sky looks heavy." He glanced at the papers on the table. That from the county office. Ben tapped the edge of the document. They want us to register the property officially if we mean to keep it running as a refuge. A few signatures, a form or two. Nothing complicated, but it needs doing proper. Daniel took a seat beside him, his expression thoughtful. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. The ranch had begun as a quiet inheritance, but now it had grown into something larger. There were people depending on it, people finding purpose here. The thought filled him with quiet pride, but also with the fear of failure. Luke folded his arms, his tone calm but firm. We should do it. If the government needs a name, let us give them one. Ben nodded approval. I was thinking something simple. The Home for Veterans of the Meadow. A place that says what it means. Claire smiled faintly, her voice gentle but sure. The Meadow, Home for Veterans. It sounds like a place that heals. Daniel looked around the table at the faces of those who had come to mean more to him than he had expected. Ben, the steady mentor, who had become the bridge to his grandfather memory. Luke, the young soldier finding his footing again. Claire, the quiet nurse who brought compassion where it had long been missing. Each of them had found something worth staying for. He reached for the pen, his voice low. Let us make it real then. They spent the rest of the morning filling out forms, checking old deeds, and writing simple descriptions of what the house had become. Buddy stayed close, lying beneath the window, his head on his paws, ears twitching at every rustle outside. When the last page was signed, Daniel folded the documents, carefully placing them into a worn brown envelope. Tomorrow, he and Ben would drive into town to deliver them. By afternoon, the wind began to rise. The sky turned darker clouds churning together with a distant rumble of thunder. Daniel moved through the yard with quick, measured steps, securing loose boards, checking the roof beams that still needed repair. The first drops fell heavy dark spots spreading across the porch steps. Ben came out carrying the envelope in a tin box to keep it dry. His old jacket flapped against the wind, his cap pulled low. We will take this in tomorrow morning, he said, raising his voice over the growing wind. For now, let us keep this place together. Luke and Claire joined them, helping to move tools into the shed. The rain began in earnest, a sudden sheet of silver that blurred the fields and sent the air into a cool frenzy. The sound of it filled the yard, drumming on the roof and flowing in streams down the path. Daniel stepped onto the porch to check the nails along the edge of the newly fixed awning. The wood creaked under the weight of water. He reached up, adjusting one loose beam, but the wind caught stronger than before. The rain lashed sideways, blinding for a moment. Buddy barked sharp and loud, his body tense, ears forward. He moved toward the far corner of the porch, his voice rising into a deep, urgent howl. Daniel turned instinctively, following the dog gaze. A large beam above the doorway had shifted in the wind, the nails strained and the wet wood bending. The next moment, Buddy leaped forward, his body colliding with Daniel, leg hard enough to knock him aside. The beam came down, striking the porch rail where he had been standing. The crash echoed through the storm, splintering wood across the boards. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Rain poured through the gap. Buddy stood over. Daniel soaked his fur, plastered to his frame, eyes wide and chest heaving. Daniel pushed himself up, heart pounding, his voice rough with disbelief. You saved me again, old friend. Ben and Luke rushed out, their faces pale. Ben's eyes flicked to the fallen beam, then to Daniel. You all right, son? Daniel nodded, breath still unsteady. thanks to him. They worked together through the storm, securing the broken section, covering it with tarp until the worst of the rain passed. The air cooled, and the thunder rolled away toward the horizon. By night, the ranch stood quiet again, the damage small, but the lesson large. Inside, the lamp burned low, casting warm light across the kitchen. Buddy lay near the hearth, eyes half closed, tail giving the faintest twitch. Daniel sat beside him, drying his hair with a towel. Ben set the tin box on the table, tapping it once. "Tomorrow we take this and first thing. You have built something worth protecting here, Daniel." Daniel nodded, looking toward the dog. "Not just me. All of us." The next morning, the valley gleamed under sunlight. The rain had washed everything clean, the air bright and fresh. Birds sang from the trees, and the wet grass sparkled like glass. Daniel and Ben drove into town, the papers sealed inside the tin box. The road was muddy, but open the world shining under the morning sky. When they returned later that day, a white envelope waited in the mailbox at the gate. The seal of the county glimmered faintly under the sun. Daniel tore it open, his hand steady. Inside was the letter of confirmation stamped and signed. The Meadow Home for Veterans was officially recognized. He handed the paper to Ben, who read it slowly, his lips curving into a rare, proud smile. "Looks like it is official now." Daniel looked out toward the horizon, where the fields rolled like waves under the wind. Buddy stood beside him, tail raised, eyes bright. The old house stood strong behind them, washed clean by the storm, its walls glowing pale under the light. For the first time, Daniel felt not like a man repairing a broken home, but a man building a future. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the branches of the tall oak trees, casting slow, shifting shadows over the gravel path. The air was warm, but gentle, filled with the sound of cicadas and the scent of cut grass. It was the kind of summer day that carried no urgency, only calm, as if the land itself had exhaled after a long season of struggle. Daniel Harris stood by the porch steps, a rag draped over his shoulder, and a small bucket of tools beside him. He had been mending the wooden railing that had cracked slightly in the storm weeks earlier. His movements were patient, his posture relaxed. There was a quiet steadiness about him now, a sense of belonging that had taken root deep in his chest. The house behind him glowed softly under the sun, its new coat of paint pale and clean. The sign by the gate read, "The Meadow Home for Veterans," letters carved by hand, now smoothed and polished. Buddy rested near the porch, his fur glinting golden in the light, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. He was older now, with faint streaks of gray near his muzzle, but his eyes still shone bright and watchful. Every small sound drew the subtle flick of his ears. He had become the silent guardian of the home, his presence both strength and comfort to all who passed through its door. Inside the house came the faint murmur of voices. Luke Turner was repairing an old chair, humming quietly, while Claire Sutton arranged jars of herbs on the shelf near the kitchen window. The scent of mint and chamomile drifted into the air. Ben Keller sat by the doorway, whittling a small piece of wood, his hands steady, his face, calm, lined by age, but lit with contentment. The house was alive, not with noise, but with a peace that could only be earned. Daniel paused for a moment, looking across the open field, where the grass swayed under the soft wind. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like purpose. From far down the road came the faint rumble of an engine. Daniel lifted his head. A small, dusty car appeared at the edge of the drive, its hood dented, and paint faded from years under the sun. The vehicle slowed near the gate, then stopped completely. A young man stepped out. He looked no older than 22, with dark hair that fell untidily across his forehead and skin tanned from long days outdoors. His frame was lean but weary, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. His uniform jacket was gone, replaced by a simple cotton shirt and jeans torn at one knee. His boots, though scuffed, were laced with care. His eyes were dark gray, heavy with fatigue, yet holding a faint, cautious hope as he took in the sight of the house before him. He stood by the car door for a moment, uncertain, his shoulders drawn slightly forward, as though bracing for disappointment. Then the gate creaked under his hand as he pushed it open. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. Buddy ears twitched his head lifting from the porch floor. The dog rose slowly, muscles moving under the coat of gold and black. He watched the stranger for a long moment, then trotted forward, tail wagging once. The young man stopped in his tracks, his hand tightening on the strap of his worn duffel bag. Buddy came closer, sniffed the air, and circled him once before sitting directly in front of him, tail sweeping across the dust. The dog looked up, meeting the young man's gaze, and then simply lay down, paws stretched forward, muzzle resting on the ground. The young man let out a shaky breath, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "Guess this means I am welcome." From the porch, Daniel smiled, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. He set the hammer down and walked forward. His steps were even and unhurried, his presence calm. "You are," he said, his tone steady and kind. "Welcome to the Meadow Home for Veterans." The young man blinked, as if unsure he had heard right. His lips parted, but no words came. He swallowed hard and nodded, eyes glistening with restrained emotion. Daniel could see the tremor in his hand, the silent battle between pride and gratitude that every soldier carried after too many nights on the road. "Come on in," Daniel said gently. "We have coffee and supper waiting. You look like you could use both." The young man hesitated, then followed him up the porch steps. Buddy walked between them, glancing back occasionally as if to ensure they both made it safely. Inside the house, the warm scent of food and fresh wood filled the air. Luke looked up from his work, giving a brief nod of welcome. Claire smiled softly, motioning toward an empty chair. Ben raised his mug slightly in greeting. The young man sat slowly, his body still tense. "I am Adam Brooks," he said after a moment. "Served in the infantry, got out last month. Been driving since? Nowhere to go, I guess." Daniel poured him a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. "Then you found the right place." Adam looked down at the steaming mug, his hands trembling slightly. The warmth spread through his fingers, and something in him broke quietly. His shoulders lowered, his breath steadied. For the first time since leaving the battlefield, he felt safe. Buddy lay near his feet, tail brushing gently against his boot. Adam reached down hesitantly and scratched behind the dog ear. Buddy sighed content and pressed closer. Claire watched them, her eyes soft. "Every soul finds its way here sooner or later," she said quietly. Luke leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You are lucky," he added with a faint grin. "The dog decides who stays and who does not. Looks like you passed." Adam smiled faintly, and for the first time in months, the expression reached his eyes. Outside, the light shifted, golden rays pouring through the windows, scattering across the wooden floor. The sound of laughter rose gentle and unforced. Ben began telling a story from decades past, his voice carrying through the room like an old song. The others listened, smiles tugging at their faces. Daniel stood by the window, watching the scene unfold. The house had become what his grandfather dreamed it to be, not a monument, but a refuge. Each person within those walls carried a story of loss and endurance, and together they had built something whole again. Buddy lifted his head, meeting Daniel's gaze from across the room. The dog eyes shone bright with quiet understanding, as if he too could sense that this was the ending they had been working toward all along. Outside, the last of the day slipped into dusk. The porch lamp flickered to life, casting its warm glow onto the yard. The fields stretched out endless and green, the wind moving through them like a slow, gentle breath. Inside the house, laughter continued, soft and real, joined by the sound of Buddy bark echoing once before fading into content silence. Daniel took a deep breath, his chest full, his heart steady. He looked around the room, at the faces lit by lamplight, each of them carrying the same peace he felt. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Home." The wind moved softly through the open window, carrying with it the scent of summer grass and new beginnings. The meadow home stood bright against the falling light, a haven built by hands that had once known only war, now shaped by trust, love, and second chances. The meadow home stood as a quiet reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple far beyond what the heart could imagine. It was not the wood or the walls that made it strong, but the people who found hope within it. Daniel, Buddy, and those who came after had turned sorrow into purpose and solitude into belonging. Each nail driven, each seed planted, and each shared meal became a symbol of faith that no one is ever truly lost when they are loved. In that humble place under the wide Montana sky, Daniel often thought about how every life touched another, like threads in a vast, unseen design. Perhaps that was the miracle all along, not thunder or light from heaven, but the gentle way hearts found each other in brokenness and built something whole again. As the sun faded and the first stars appeared, Daniel whispered a prayer that all who sought peace might find it as he did through love and faith. May the Lord bless every soul who listens to this story. May you carry its warmth into your own life, help someone who has fallen, share a smile with a stranger, and keep your heart open to the quiet miracles that God places before you each day. If this story has touched your heart, share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe for more stories of hope and faith. May God bless you and keep you always.